to our November Climate Reality PDX chapter meeting. This meeting, we're going to focus really on the experience that Frank and Annette had in Glasgow at COP26 meeting the last couple of weeks. So you guys are freshly going to hear stuff right off the airplane, I'm guessing. But before we start that, I'm going to read a land acknowledgement. Wherever we are in the world, we find ourselves on land that was the honored home of generations before we got here. We open our gathering today by acknowledging the indigenous people who cared for this land for millennia and whose voices today remind us to come into a right relationship with the land and with each other. I'm living in the Portland, Oregon metropolitan area on the territory of the traditional village sites of the Chinook, Multnomah, Cathlamet, Clackamas, Tualatin, Kalapuya, and Molalla tribes, and many other tribes and bands of people. May the stewardship of indigenous people wherever we are inspire deep respect for the land that sustains our life. Okay. And with that, I'd like to know, is Keith here? And if he's not, that's okay. Frank, I'd like to hand over to you and Annette to talk about what's going on in Scotland the last couple of weeks.
Okay, just give me just a moment here. There we
Nope.
go. Come on, boy.
Well, they are not well prepared, are they? No. No, they're not. My hands are cold.
Share the screen. Okay, do you see my second screen here?
Yes.
Okay, good, good. Well, first of all, thank you for inviting us to come present. It's been a wild ride, and got a number of things that definitely we want to talk with you about. First of all, just a little bit about us. We were both observers with Quaker Earth Care Witness, and I was also part of what was called the U.S. ACE delegation. ACE is short for Action for Climate Empowerment. So what we are going to, oops, come on, boy, hit the right buttons. There we go. Okay, so what we're going to talk about, first of all, what COP26 was, who showed up, what it looked like, what its goals were, and how the outcomes matched up with the goals. So starting off the top of the list here with what was COP26, I think the first editorial comment I can make about it is it was a really big, extremely complicated, confusing, frenetic negotiating event that took place on the other side of the pond in Glasgow, Scotland. There's two pictures there that are germane. First of all, the one over here, let's see, that's okay, that's left. The one over here on your left there is a view of the line one day getting into what's called the blue zone or the security zone. I'll talk a little bit about what that is once we get into it. It took us about 2 hours to actually get, hour and a half to 2 hours to actually get in. The other one over here is once you're inside the campus. This was one of the major lounge areas and place for a number of presentations, including a case where we got a chance to listen to Al Gore for a few minutes. So anyway, another comment here in terms of what COP26 was, it was U.S. climate envoy John Kerry described it as our last best chance to avert the worst environmental consequences for the world of accelerating climate change. A little bit of hyperbole in there, but not too much. Something I think I may have talked about last time, but just in case, just a quick rehash for those who are maybe struggling with what COP means. It's short for 26th Conference of the Parties of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, UNFCCC being the actual charter that was, or excuse me, a treaty that was signed in 1994, originated in 1992, that was aimed at that issue of combating dangerous human interference with the climate system. I always kind of like the way they phrase that. The major landmark that had a lot to do with this conference was, of course, the Paris Accords, and that's a treaty. That sort of the latest the 2015 iteration of the original UNFCCC treaty that was unique in that, number one, it set some temperature targets. At that time, it was the one that was everybody agreed on was the 2.0 degrees Celsius, 2100 temperature increase above pre-industrial average. The other one was 1.5, and that was mainly at the behest of the island nations. In addition to that, there was sort of a first ever attempt to set emission reduction commitments. There was a lot of discussion about climate finance. I want to mention some of that tonight. And most importantly, there were mechanisms put in place for both monitoring and adjusting what was called NDCs, nationally declared commitments, to achieve the temperature target of 1.5 to 2.0. COP26, which was supposed to happen last year in 2020, got booted to this year. It was the place where the important 5-year stock take was to take place. In other words, sort of an examination of how well we're doing, and commitment to additional reduction. No, what am I searching for? Yeah, bear with me. I'm still kind of on Scotland time, so it's sometimes the words come out. Anyway, yeah, so there was the mechanisms for monitoring and adjusting the NDCs, and COP26 was where that increased ambition was supposed to happen. In other words, we adjust what we're doing to really hone in on that target. And it was also the complete place where what was called the Paris Rule Book, in other words, the guidelines to actually implement what was agreed upon in the Paris Accords, that was where it was supposed to happen. Backtrack for a moment, who attended the COP? Well, the short answer to that is about 30,000 people. I think it's probably about the second biggest COP in the history of the COPs, because apparently Paris was about 40,000. Now this 30,000 included negotiators from 150 plus member states of the UN. It also included a whole bunch of us observer types from businesses, subnational governments, education, faith groups, community organizations, tribes, trade unions, and what we call NGOs or non-governmental organizations. So that's environmental groups and relief organizations, et cetera. And then of course there was the UN staff, as well as the support staff to keep all of this going. And believe me, it was a major endeavor. And part of the question is, what did it look like? I'm going to do the broad strokes, and Annette's going to come in and talk about some of the personal details. But over on again, that's the left. Over on the left side of the screen, you see an aerial shot that was actually snitched out of Google Earth, and the site map of what was called the blue zone. And the blue zone was the security area where observers, negotiators, support staff all were being housed. So some people like to think this is where all the action happens. That's not quite true, but it's certainly where a lot of the action happens. And these middle panels here, you see again another picture of this. This was one of the worst days. I think it was day 2 of the conference, and that was the World World Leaders Climate Summit. So there was a lot of high-powered people, and security was particularly tight. And there were a lot of people wanting to get in. So that's what it looked like there. Again, this is that one area that I showed you earlier that is part of the civil society space, civil society being where the observers, and then down below at the bottom, picture of the negotiating area. And now the pictures on the side are important because one of the things that was an important lesson about this COP, particularly for those of us who've been to other COPs, is there's an impression that everything that's important happens in the UN sanctioned space. And one of the unique things about COP26 in Scotland is it had an enormous amount of support from grassroots in Scotland. The bottom picture down here, where I'm wobbling my cursor around, was one of the venues for what was called the Climate Fringe. And these were environmental groups, artists, community people, faith churches, etc., that all had events spread out in the metro area between Glasgow and Edinburgh. Pretty spectacular what they were doing. One of the other things that some of you may know about, but Climate Reality in Scotland, in conjunction with the Scottish government, arranged a whole series of meetings, kind of like this one right here, linking remote communities to what was happening inside the blue zone. And these were the climate, these were called the climate cafes. And there's been some attempt to get this started in other parts of the world. In fact, the Southwestern chapter here, the Oregon Southwest chapter, has a multi-faith climate cafe going now. And the one thing a lot of you probably heard on the news is 150,000 people on a very wet Saturday braved the rain and the cold to make their voices heard and essentially walk fairly close to the blue zone, so the negotiators were reminded why they were there. And before that day, right there, there was another march that was a youth march of about 50,000. So it's so there was really a strong sense that I got out of this COP that there was a lot that happened outside the UN sanctioned space. Okay, I'm going to pop over and turn the next few slides over to Annette.
So I'm going to talk about what it felt like to just be there. In a few words, it was busy, crowded, and loud. And the people were from everywhere. It was overwhelming because it was just this moment in history where so many people were concerned about this, and they were coming at it from many different points of view. And it was incredible to see this. This particular slide just shows people going through the entrance process, which involved showing your COVID test results every day, because you had to do it the night before, and then report it to NHS, the National Health Service. And then you had to go through airport security. And it was very slow, but it was also an opportunity to just kind of talk to the people who are around you from wherever they were, which was always interesting. Once you got in, it was kind of a mishmash of who was there. And, you know, you were just in a spot and here somebody else was. And so where I was at this particular moment was where the UN Youth Coalition was. And they were just having a ball. It was really fun to watch them. And I just thought, wow, we need this kind of energy. And in fact, I will say one of the things that was really remarkable is that many of the people at COP were quite young. It was really interesting. Yep. So this particular slide shows the pavilion area where I think you can see in the background, there's a sign that says Australia. And then you'll see another one in a minute, but all of the countries that were represented here had pavilions. And it was really interesting to see what they were focused on, because they were showcasing their efforts and their issues. Okay, go ahead. One of the most interesting one to me was the International Indigenous Peoples Coalition Pavilion. And it was this tiny little room. I mean, seriously, they could have had a huge room and people would still be wanting to come in. But it was simultaneously interpreted in many languages, which was also interesting. And what they were discussing right there, I only heard a little bit of it, but they were discussing how to coordinate efforts around climate issues that were impacting their various communities that were similar. And it was a very high level kind of discussion. It was a very interesting thing. Yep. So the other thing, I'm going to show you this. Okay, keep in mind, let's see, I think, try to see which countries you'll see when this video goes. This was early in the morning. So there weren't too many people here yet. But later in the afternoon, you could barely get down the hall because it was wall-to-wall people. And you know, when you look at this from here, you really kind of cringe because of the fact that with the COVID outbreak, you think, oh my gosh, you know, what are these people doing? But keep in mind, the people who organized this spent a lot of energy in keeping us all safe. Everybody there had to be tested daily to get in. So I didn't feel particularly vulnerable. And it was just this kind of exciting place to just see what people were doing. And some of the pavilions were from non-governmental organizations that were showcasing what they were doing. The one on the right, if you can't read it, says Compassion in World Farming, which was encouraging people to limit meat and dairy in eating. The one on the left, I'm going to have Frank tell you what that is because it's his field.
Yeah, the one on the left was the Cryosphere Pavilion. And there's a couple of things to note about this picture. Excuse me, not right, left. First of all, you can see behind this poster for Arctic sea ice, group of people witnessing a talk, and many of the pavilions were essentially gathering spaces to hear various spiels from the groups responsible for the pavilions. In this particular case, they also had a variety of exhibits, essentially some reader boards here about some of the issues involved, the cryosphere being essentially the frozen part of the planet, glaciers, sea ice, etc. And so what these reader boards was essentially talking about those issues.
Mhm. So this particular slide shows the Climate Action Center, which is also known as We Are Still In.
It's now America is still in.
Oh,
It used to
America's
be
still
We
in.
Are Still In.
Yeah, it's America Still In. And because when Trump was president, you know, the main American saying was that we are still in. Maybe Trump wasn't there, but we were. So that continues.
And actually, I want to correct something. It should be America is all in. I sort of got mixed up with their old name and their new name. The other group down there, U.S. Action for Climate Empowerment Coalition, is actually something that is built into the original UNFCCC treaty, that every country was to have an effort to engage their populace in climate, in what was needed to deal with climate issues. And that being said, many countries it was a suggestion rather than something that was actually implemented. And it took basically the US for the very first time this year actually has an ACE that is part of the federal government.
So the whole time we were there, we were totally aware of protests that were planned. We were totally aware of all of the things that were going around, that were happening. And it made you realize that, yeah, the building was a part of it, but what was going on outside was equally important. And it was overwhelming, and it was encouraging, and it was frustrating, and it was disappointing in a lot of ways. How could it be all those things?
But there was some comic relief.
There was some comic relief. And it's interesting because, as we all know, comedy gets to the core of things very quickly in ways that nothing else can. So this was a whole wall of comics.
Okay, so one of the last things I want to talk about here is what were the goals of COP26, and how did what actually happened measure up to the goals? And these were goals that were essentially set out by the UK COP presidency. And they went like this. First of all, the first goal, net zero and 1.5 degrees. Countries were called on to reach net zero carbon emissions by 2050. Remember that number, 2050. And so as to keep global temperatures below 1.5 degrees C. Incidentally, the 2050 is what the IPCC recommended in their volume 1 of the report that came out in August. The second goal down there, protecting ecosystems and habitats. So states, in this case, we're really talking nation states, are encouraged to protect, restore ecosystems, and also to build resilient infrastructures that are able to withstand climate change. It's a particularly important one given what the IPCC report from in August was saying. Money is always a big topic in these negotiations. And so when we talk money in this particular case, it's the issue of mobilizing finance, or getting developed countries to mobilize finance to help poorer countries tackle climate change, both in terms of leapfrogging our fossil fuel development, and moving straight into renewable energy systems to power to power their societies, but also to be able to adapt to the changes that are happening to them. And actually, the $100, excuse me, a lot of people wish it was only that amount. The $100 billion figure there is what was asked, I think actually 5 years before the Paris Accord. So we're talking 2010. There was an agreement that developed countries would, by 2020, mobilize something like $100 billion a year in climate finance that would be available to developing countries. The last goal down here that was important, collaboration. What you're looking at there is parties, again, the nation states of the UN at COP21 would need to actually go through and finalize the Paris rulebook. In other words, finalize the rules by which the Paris Agreement would begin to happen. Okay, so how did they all fare? Well, we'll take a look at goal one. You did have 138 countries pledged to be net zero by between 2050 and 2070. And actually, if you think back to Earth Day of this year, April 22nd, the federal government had the World Climate Leaders Summit, and many nations brought in their original, what we call the NDCs, or nationally declared commitments, saying, okay, by this date, we're going to be carbon neutral. So that part looks good. And now the key questions that popped in here is, how would they achieve this? And there is, in some activist circles, a certain amount of disdain for the term net zero, because you have places like Saudi Arabia and Poland that are looking at maintaining their same fossil fuel extraction activities, if not ramping them up, and relying on largely unproven or still very primitive carbon sequestration strategies. In other words, taking carbon out of the waste stream of power plants and the like. So there's some discomfort among a lot of people with how some of these countries intend to achieve it. Are there commitments soon enough? Well, again here, remember 2050. This is what IPCC is saying, that the entire planet needs to be at net zero. The date that the entire planet needs to be at net zero for us to stay at 1.5 by the year 2100. And you have India's is 2060, I believe. Saudi Arabia is 2070. Russia is roughly about the same time. So there are some countries sort of hedging their bets and dragging their heels a bit. Next question, are there collective commitments enough to keep the 1.5 at 2100? Well, an analysis that I've seen of what was brought to the table this time is we're better off than at the end of Paris, which was the commitments that were brought to the table said, well, if we maintain our commitments that we've made, 3.6 is what we can expect in 2100. Well, the analysis I'm seeing is between 1.8 and 2.4. The 1.8 is manageable. The 2.4, according to the IPCC report, you can pretty much kiss off the coral reefs of the planet, plus a number of other unpleasantries. And most importantly, the question in here is, will they follow through? And there's some real questions about that, because some of the commitments that were made in 2015 are still waiting for action. Goal 2, protecting ecosystems and habitats. Now, I threw in some accomplishments, or if you will, side events, side agreements that somewhat attached to that goal. Some of them are a little bit stray from it, but nevertheless, some noteworthy things. First of all, more than 100 countries sign an agreement to halt and reverse deforestation and land degradation by 2030. US was part of that. 107 countries sign an agreement to reduce methane emissions by 30% by the year 2050 as compared to the 2020 levels. And the important thing about methane is it's nearly 12 times as effective as it's nearly 12 times more effective at capturing infrared than CO2 is. In other words, it's a much more potent greenhouse gas. Then you have the fact that 30 countries and financial institutions pledged to end direct international finance by the end of 2020. Unfortunately, what you also have at the end of COP20, at the end of the COP26 negotiations, was a significant watering down of the agreement language about ending fossil fuel subsidies as well as phasing out coal. And much of that watering down was being done by China and by India, and the US and Australia had a hand in that picture too. Also, another thing that electric car manufacturers are going to be real happy about is the fact that 100 entities, now this amounts to not only governments, but also trade associations, car manufacturers, etc., signed a global agreement to make all new vehicles zero emission by the end of 2022. And that one seems a little ambitious, but we'll see. Now, back to the money issue here. And the money issue actually falls into two buckets. The first one is the Climate Adaptation Fund, the $100 billion that I talked about earlier. Again here, there's a real disconnect between what was, if you will, put in the treaty in 2010 and what's actually happened. And so what came out of the Glasgow Agreement is the fact that the final agreement urges developed countries to at least double their collective provision of climate finance for adaptations to developing countries by 2050. And then lastly, there's a whole issue of what we call loss and damage. You can think of this as reparations to the least developed countries that suffer, that have contributed the least to our climate issues, but yet are bearing the brunt of many of the climate related impacts, extreme weather, sea level rise, flooding, etc. So this is a high point of contention. Many of the developing countries do not want to touch this. Many of the developed countries don't want to touch this. Many of the developing countries, on the other hand, are saying, look, you owe this to us. We're sinking because of what you have done, dumping your industrial effluents into the atmosphere. Anyway, what actually came out of it was developing countries agreed to continue the discussion on loss and damage, but no commitment was made to actually fund any loss and damage programs. Okay, last but not least, the collaboration part. Well, the good point was what we call the Paris Rule Book did get finalized, such that a lot of the loopholes that were in it were closed. But there were some important questions about what we call transparency, which is a way of keeping track of whether or not nations are in fact following through on the commitments that they make in terms of emission reduction. There's also a whole big issue about what we call carbon markets. In other words, putting a price on carbon and factoring that into such things as energy production, et cetera. And there's still a lot of debate in terms of how these markets are managed. Well, it came right down to the final, just before the gavel. All the parties, again, parties being the nations, accepted the final package. It was delivered a day late, but it was the enthusiasm about it was less than universal. And in terms of the final agreement, was it sufficient to keep us to 2100, to keep the 2100 temperature rise to less than 1.5? Preliminary analysis says no. But one of the good things that came out of it was under this set of bubbles over here are essentially showing the trajectory to 2050 in terms of adjusting emissions, adjusting a variety of other mitigation strategies that countries use to achieve their targets. But according to this, it's about every 5 years you have what's called a stock take. In other words, an analysis of progress. And at the end of this COP, it was said, we need to start making this every year. And there will be certainly one at the next COP, which will be in Egypt, another stock take. Okay. The only thing I want to remind folks about is during the I'll put the URL for this in the chat. But before left for COP26, put together a gateway for virtual engagement with the COP. And in that page, this is a screenshot of that page, there is actually a link over to daily logs from a couple of different groups. One, the International Institute for Sustainable Development. They do an excellent job at giving you these thumbnail snapshots day by day, as well as a final summary that are well worth looking at, give you a sense of what took place. And then another group down there, Climate Generations, is a youth education related group that takes a group of high school and college students to the COPs every year, and they regularly report out their experience. So it's a way to get kind of that firsthand experience and a little bit less of the policy wonk stuff. Okay, yeah. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and do and so questions, comments.
Just to say thank you. That was I really appreciated you sharing the human aspect of it, and how it must have felt to have so many peoples of different nations coming together in one spot.
Yeah. And I'll reinforce what Annette said in terms of it. It was intriguing, frustrating, and disappointing.
Mhm.
I mean, there were a lot. I think about what Al Gore said, not Al Gore, but what John Kerry said about the importance of this. And I think that the fact that these guys kicked the can down the road again, well, that's not unusual. It's sort of expected after 4 COPs. But it is definitely disappointing given where we are with the issue right now.
But there's also another thing that we have to remember, and that is that this particular COP was was held right in the middle of a pandemic. And so there's been a lot of comment that it wasn't very well organized. And inside, it sure seemed like that because you'd be told, oh, there's a meeting to go to, and then here it is, and you'd go there and they'd say, no, it moved, or it's a different time, or whatever. The communication just wasn't as good as it had been in other COPs. But here's the deal. They had 30,000 people coming daily, and they had to keep them safe. Now, I will say, I think they spent 90% of their organizational effort on keeping us safe. Multi-level tests. It was just remarkable. But in terms of, being in there to see stuff, it was hard.
Yeah, I can only imagine that the enormity of the topics covered would have stretched any organizational development for what's going on there. Very difficult. I'm curious, how did you get invited, and what was different from your being invited to people who just went to hang out in the streets? You got to go in the blue zone and kind of get into the conversations, I imagine, but how do you get invited to something like that?
Yeah, I'll try to take a long story and make it as short as possible. But this is, like I say, the third COP we've actually attended, the fourth one we've been involved with. And the very first one, which was 2017, COP 23, I had received we decided, okay, we're just going to travel through Germany and go to the COP. And a friend of mine had said, you really don't need to have credentials or anything to get into the civil society zone. Well, so we went to Germany. We're taking a big long circuit, visiting a number of places. And I get this email from a friend saying that she had who teaches over at Lewis and Clark, saying that she had a former student of hers, who was looking at trying to get college students to attend the COP. And this was like a week before it was started. And so my friend said, that's pretty unlikely you're going to get some college students to fly over and attend the COP. But I do have this friend who is traveling right now, who is headed for the COP. You might see if he's got credentials. And so we did something that's totally unheard of, which has got credentials in the space of about 4 days. In other times, I've had to go out and search through various organizations and say, okay, we're looking at going. Do you have credentials you could provide? And actually, by the second COP, we got credentials through Quaker Earth Care Witness. We're both Quakers, and so it was pretty much slam dunks after that.
So are you saying they allocate tickets, I guess if that's the right word, to through organizations that are working on climate change?
Yep.
One fashion or other. The Quaker organization that you're a part of might get 50 tickets, and then you kind of go to that organization and lobby to get 2. Is that kind of how it works?
Yeah, in this case, they get 4 tickets.
Oh, gotcha.
Yeah, and it just happens that it's a very small organization that not a lot of people know anything about. And I happen to know them. So, and the fact that we went once, they sort of, okay, if you're going again, we can pass some on to you. So.
Excellent. Are there any other questions for Frank?
I have a question for Frank, and thank you for your coverage. Just going back to your goals, you mentioned net zero goal that 138 pledged to meet the goal, that rough math, 60 or so chose not to pledge at all.
Yeah.
I mean, whereas Paris, almost 200 had signed on. So what happened to the 60 countries that didn't pledge?
Here's the big deal is you gotta, rather than look at numbers of countries, you gotta look at who are the ones who did pledge. And the
Mhm.
fact that you've got China and the US in there takes care of well over 60% of the emissions. The countries who didn't pledge, most of them, I mean, the per capita emissions are in maybe fractions of a kilogram per year versus the the god awful number that we have for folks here in North America.
Mhm.
Mhm.
So it's mostly 60 countries got disillusioned with progress.
Well, 60 countries simply aren't emitting that much,
Right.
and they've got other things to take care of, like being in the middle of civil wars or what have you.
Mhm. So they may or may not even been there.
They were pretty much, I'm trying to think. I've seen different numbers, but I know there's about 197, close to almost 200 member states in the UN. And there were, I think, about 185 in attendance. So I think you had most of the world covered.
Mhm. So the same thing with the goal 2 for forests and methane.
Yeah.
Same. The big countries are on board. The little ones may or may not have weighed in.
Mixed on that one. I don't know how much Russia was in on some of those. Also Brazil.
Right.
Yeah,
That
and when
that
you-
one we knew even before COP.
Yeah,
Brazil weighed in before this negotiation even started.
yeah. I would bet that Brazil probably didn't sign the deforestation agreement, given given their economic priorities right now.
Mhm.
But that is one of those cases where they are definitely somebody you would have wanted to have sign into that.
Yeah.
Because they've got the biggest stock of trees on the planet.
Right, okay. Do we have any other questions for Frank and Annette at this point? And I think you have offered your email address in the past for people who might
Yeah.
have questions. Is that still okay?
Yeah, that's still fine. It looked like Holly had a question, then I had one final comment.
Okay, Holly?
Yeah, I'm wondering if at any time in any of these events, if anybody has heard anything about, I guess I'd call it wise democracy. And there's a huge movement on how groups can communicate and make decisions. And alternatives to, okay, we put this many people together and these guys outvote these people and it's just their tough luck. And you're not necessarily getting the best ideas because there's not cross-pollination. People are just standing on this side or on this side saying, this is what I believe, this is what I want. And I have watched this for a while. Co-Intelligence Institute, run in Oregon, actually, by Tom Atlee. And I believe that that's going to be one of the hopes of human beings in general, is instead of saying, this is how we make choices and decisions, this is how we've always done it, and it's never going to change because this is what people are like. And there's some powerful and amazing stuff. And the cafes that were mentioned, that's definitely language out of that movement. And I'm wondering if there was much of that or more of that or almost none of that. And I guess I'm throwing my request in, will people please think about wise democracy and the literally, I think, hundreds of ways that you can organize groups for different purposes. And to me, it's like magical. I got a little bit involved in it here in Oregon. And I'm just tossing that out there. I feel really strongly that if people could communicate in ways that by their very nature were collaborative rather than at each other's throats. That's all I have to say.
Yeah, I think it's two responses to that. First of all, I think that if you looked beyond the COPs, and I mean beyond the UN sanctioned space out into some of the activities that were going on around, what you're saying there is very much an issue people are talking about.
Okay, good.
But in terms of what happened within the UN space, particularly within the negotiating hall,
Yeah.
two things about that. First of all, I really almost wish that there was, we know a person who's another Quaker who's involved with a group called Quaker United Nations Office.
Huh.
And she's their climate representative. And she also used to work with the UN. And she has a really good insight into the mechanics of all of this. But when you talk about the mechanics, there's one of the intriguing things to me about the UN is that if you look at how the UN operates, it is structured on sort of a Western democratic model. And in fact, it's even further than that. I mean, being a Quaker, we have this notion decisions are made by consensus.
Right.
And literally, this last agreement, if one of the parties said, no, we don't agree with this, there would be no agreement and they'd have to go back to the boards again. Now, that being said, you've got this democratic process going on with a group of nation states, many of whom are not democratic. I mean, you certainly can't, yeah, there's just a number of countries where you certainly can't say that about them. So that's kind of, yeah, that's fascinating thing to me that I really want to try to understand a little bit more about. So
Well, I'll just say briefly, I would love it if the United States would find new ways to make decisions. Seriously, just
that would be nice.
Yeah.
That would- Excellent conversation, Holly. Appreciate that. Hey, I believe Linda, you had a question for Frank. Are you still there? Yes. Hey, all right.
Yeah, I saw a really interesting short video today of a presentation that was given at COP where the speaker was saying that meat is obsolete and that serving beef at COP was irresponsible. And I wondered if you had seen that presentation or if you saw, you know, any, I'd love to hear any comments that you might have about the food that was served there, you know, especially because of the big issue about methane. Yeah.
Well, yeah, a couple of things about that. I did not hear that particular talk, but we did sit down and have a chat with somebody I know from Cornell who has done this whole, he's basically written a book on climate and diet.
Do you remember the name of it?
I don't remember the name of it. but so, and he wasn't, he said, yeah, I have a hamburger once in a while, but it's once in a great while. And so he was a little bit more nuanced about it. I'm not sure about, I understand why that would be an argument for some people. I will also say that I do remember listening to a Union of Concerned Scientists podcast talking about what's called agroforestry, in which you're talking about agriculture where you are using cattle to restore soil rather than demolish soil.
Hmm.
So so there's a real difference between that and massive feedlots.
Yes.
Right, excellent. Thank you, Linda. Very contributing member of the Climate Friendly Food Action Team as part of the Climate Reality. I wanted to let people know where your question's coming from.
Okay.
Hey, so I'm gonna kind of stop the conversation and say thank you to Frank and Annette for taking the time to put together your presentation and to present it to us. Fascinating. I know that I've heard a lot about the COP meetings through listening to the radio and reading what I read in the paper. And I think you guys made it very real. So I appreciate that. It was super valuable. And some thank yous. And if anybody has any more questions, I think we can put Frank's email in the chat and you're welcome to ask him. And I wanted to kind of change directions a little bit and introduce Nick Keenan, who's been working with Amy on our relaunched website. And Nick's going to do a quick what the website's all about right now, just so you can get a sense of where Climate Reality Portland is headed. Nick is starting to share his screen, and there's a new website. Go ahead, take it away, Nick.
It is live as of today. So yeah, we've got this will hopefully help our communication, especially around events and also from the different committees. Some of the things that are involved here, it'll be a little bit easier to just go to the homepage and find out what meetings are happening. Or if you want, you can even go to the calendar page and look at upcoming chapter meetings. We have the Zoom link active right now because this might be a register link depending on what's going on, but you can also add these meetings to your local calendar, iCal, Google, Outlook, just by clicking those buttons. Our different committees also have their regular meetings included on that. And we're developing landing pages for each of our committees to tell a little bit more in-depth stories about what's going on with those committees and the specific actions that those committees are working on. Back in my home of renewable energy, we are starting to ramp up a project around the community solar program in Oregon. And if you're interested in doing that, you can actually work on signing up your own household. You don't need to put solar on your roof. You can just subscribe to an existing installation and get save money on your electricity bill. Who loses there? No one. And we're also working on helping sign up low-income subscribers. So these are the sort of like programs that we're all working on in our different committees. And the new website is going to help tell some of the stories that we're doing, go into more depth. Committees can even start writing blog posts and publishing some of the information, which we're hoping to do a little bit more of, so that we can do some of the deeper dives and share that information with our membership.
Cool.
Excellent. Thank you. Keith, did you have a question? You had the hand raised in your screen. I didn't know if that was a question you had or comment.
No, I didn't. Well, it was a question for Frank and Annette, but it was, and I put a link up, and this was just basically, I live in the world of the business side of the equation for sustainability planning, and I attended all 12 of McKinsey's presentations during COP, and I put that link up there, and the question I would have asked if we and maybe we can address this in the future, is, you know, what did you hear about and what did you see from the business side of the equation? Governments can move mountains, but they can't do it very well. Business is motivated by finance, and finance is very clear that they will not fund companies, hedge funds, and banks that don't have sustainability plans. So businesses across the world are developing significant sustainability plans that are bound by international standards and reporting and monitoring. And so that side of the equation, that side of the story, is one that you know, I hope to continue to be a part of and can bring to that. And I'll just say to on the website to Nick, is it Nick? That
Yes.
the legislative group is ramping up. I just got something from one of our legislators today, from ruin to resilience, protecting communities and preventing disasters. And it's partly information that's coming out of the infrastructure bill, and how the current infrastructure bill will and can influence and affect climate change. And certainly the other message is that we have a long ways to go there too, and the Build Back Better legislation is, you know, moving forward, and we'll do that there as well. So I just wanted to make that,
Thank you.
you know, make those links available for folks to see that business side of the equation, what's happening in the private industry and private business.
Thanks, Keith, and thanks for mentioning the business component. Frank said in the chat that business was very present. I find it shocking how advanced some businesses say they are, and how advanced some countries say they are, but really businesses seem to be outpacing a little bit. Maybe they're a little bit more nimble. They have consumers they have to think about, and they're trying to make money. But
yeah, they're motivated by money.
Yes, exactly. Thank you for that. Also, Nick, excellent, job well done. A couple of plugs in there for using the website in terms of finding out more about renewable org legislation. I like to see those plugs. Check out the website. It's going to be great. I wanted to take this moment to acknowledge Keith, Wolf, and Zoe Pettit, who are new members to our leadership team. And Keith is, as you mentioned, working on some of the business side of climate. And I think you're going to be busy about a year from now, maybe giving the same presentation or doing a co-presentation with Frank on COP27. Is that true there, Keith?
Yeah, I'm a past president of the American Fisheries Society, and I'm sponsored to go next year.
All right, there we go.
Best scuba diving in the world.
A lot of representation by the Portland PDX Climate Reality membership. I like to see that. And Zoe, who had to hop off the call, is, I think Annette mentioned that we need their energy. And she had a picture of a bunch of, they look like 20 somethings, hard for me to tell the picture. Zoe is exactly that person in that group, in that picture. She's young, she's got a lot of energy. We need her energy, and you will see her pop up in meetings to come. So glad to see that, and welcome to both of you guys to the leadership team. It's a lot of fun to have you here. Finally, we have had a lot of people asking about, can we ever get together physically again? And that would be great to say absolutely yes. I don't think we're going to end up taking COVID tests, you know, as often as you did, Frank and Annette, but we very much would like to do that, to get together and to exchange ideas physically, and certainly not put anybody at risk. And to start that conversation, I'm going to bring in Allison Connor to help us with a little poll we're going to ask of you guys to see where your interests are in terms of getting together. So Allison, you said you might take you a few minutes to describe what we're going to do here. That'd be great. And you're on mute. Yeah, there you go.
Yeah.
Excellent.
Hi there. I hope you all feel comfortable voting in public. So what I've done is just put together some questions and some answers.
Oh, you're back on mute.
Oopsie.
That's all right. Oh, you're back on mute.
That's super weird. Okay, so I'm gonna drop some questions in the chat and you can answer with a number. And so just pick the number. And so what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna just push these questions out to you really quick and I'm gonna do a countdown to finish. And then I'm gonna copy the chat so we can keep track of your responses. And so hopefully I don't mute here really quick. And if you're comfortable answering, please do. If you're not comfortable answering publicly, then just skip that question. And so forgive me as I kind of click around here to get our first question. And so you'll see that it says, this one, it says, are you interested in an in-person gathering in the next few months? And then it kind of describes it a little bit. And you could pick 1 for yes, 2 for no, or 3, it does not apply to me. And so let's see how we do.
Oh, there it is.
There we go. And I didn't mute accidentally somehow. And so just take a moment to vote. Are you interested in an in-person gathering in the next few months, holiday or a New Year gathering at an indoor?
And Allison, we're sending this back to you directly.
Yeah, it's going to be in the chat and then I'm going to copy it and yeah.
Right, in the chat, we're sending it to you, not to everybody.
Correct.
Okay.
Yes. All right. So next question is coming. I see you voted. Would you be interested in a holiday December gathering or a New Year's January gathering? 1 for holiday December, 2 for New Year's January gathering, or 3 does not apply to me. And you can just quickly vote with a number. Perfect. While you guys are cruising here, you're going faster than I can click around. This next question is about gathering indoors and specific safety protocols that you might be comfortable with. There we go. If we gather indoors, what safety protocols would you like to see? Give the numbers that represent how you're feeling. 1 for masks, 2 for vaccines, 3 for hand sanitizer, 4 for social distancing, 5, I'm good either way, 6, I'm good without safety protocols. Well, you guys are cruising here super fast. This next question is very similar, but it is about outside. Okay. Oops, that just went to Keith. Let me try that again. For some reason, that's weird. Okay, there we go. Same question, but outdoors. Same exact choices, but for outside. Oh, Zoom is being strange. This next question, I'll give you guys, okay, there we go. This next question is about what days of the week work best for you. Oh, I see where you're at there, I got it. Okay, oof, you are fast. And then this last question. Okay, and so the voting is done on the days. And then this last question is the times, what works best for you. So 1 would be 12 to 3, 2 would be 3 to 6, and 3 would be 6 to 9. And so when this meeting ends, I'm going to grab all this data and I'm going to put it in our meeting notes, and then we'll put together a meeting time, place, and the like. Well, that went fast. Okay.
Excellent. Actually, Allison, I had my doubts that you could pull this off. Well done. There, for those of you who are well versed in Zoom, there is a way that you can do surveys on Zoom, but we could not get to that portion of the Zoom meeting setup for this meeting. And Allison said, "Oh, I can do it on the chat." I said, "Okay, go for it." You did a great job. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Allison, I'll just say that, just comment that, you know, the data that I submitted represents how I feel right now.
Sure.
And it's just such a rapidly changing situation sometimes, you know, that what you feel or think 1 month doesn't hold for another month.
Sure.
know.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
things change, so I'm in education and things change so fast all the time. It's hard to keep up sometimes. And it's true, how you feel currently is changes next week because you get new information. It's difficult.
Yeah. Yes. Yes. But let's hope we have continuity through the winter.
No Delta. Right. Okay, I believe that fulfills our agenda today. Is anybody, we have a little bit of time, 10 or 15 minutes on this. If people would like to stick around and chat about all things climate change, welcome to do so. We will have our next meeting, you'll see posted on the website. And also I believe that we will send out our email blast for the meeting. Thanks for showing up, and have a great and safe December. Okay. So if anyone wants to stick around, let's speak up. Let's see.